Hello everyone, welcome back to the Painting with Plotters course. This is Module 1, Video 2. I'm very sorry that there is this huge gap between this video and the previous video. Basically, earlier this year I got really burned out and I had to take a break to recover before I can continue the production of this course. I want to share a bit more about this, but I assume that most of you came here for the plotter part, not my personal story. So I am going to put that part at the very end of this module. But welcome back. Thanks so much for waiting. Let's come back to where we left off. In the previous video, we talked about plotters and how to set up an ideal painting environment for those plotters. So we're going to continue to look at different materials and tools that you will need in order to start a plotter painting practice. In this video, we're going to look at a variety of painting surfaces. Great, let's get started. There are a huge variety of painting surfaces for painting. For instance, paper, boards, canvas, so many different types. Since most of my work so far were made with paper, let's start there. Watercolor papers are absorbent papers made for a variety of water-based fluid media. For instance, ink, watercolor, gouache, acrylic all work really well with watercolor paper. When buying paper, the most important thing to pay attention to is the weight of the paper. Watercolor paper is often heavier than paper made for drawings. This number on the package, GSM, means how heavy a square meter of this paper is. The higher the number, the thicker the paper. The paper I normally use is 300 grams. The weight of the paper normally determines how strong it is and how much paint you can put on it. The thicker the paper, the higher the price. The next thing to look for is the texture of the paper. Watercolor paper comes with different textures. You will normally see 3 different categories: cold pressed, hot pressed, and rough. My understanding is that when the paper is made, it needs to be pressed flat. And cold press, hot press, and textures basically represent different ways of pressing this paper flat. If you're committed to use a brush on those paper, you can pretty much choose whatever texture you would like. However, I also do pen drawings with those watercolor paper, and a really rough texture might actually break or bend your nib. The next set of things to decide is the size of the paper and the binding of the paper that you're getting. The size is really easy. You just pick whatever that fits your need, and keep in mind that you need to leave a little bit of space for your plotter trays and cleaning wheels. In terms of bindings, watercolor paper often comes in different formats. For instance, just individual sheets, or it would be a pad with a bundle of paper, or you will be able to find things like this. The glued block is somewhat unique for watercolor paper. It is a block of paper with 4 sides glued together. There's normally an opening on the top or bottom of the block. When you need to take a piece of paper, you would slide a long and flat tool, such as a palette knife or a spatula, into this opening, and you will be able to tear the edges, separate the glue, and then take the individual sheets. You might be wondering, why do we need watercolor paper to be glued on 4 sides? This is because watercolor paper is normally stretched before painting. Why do you need to stretch watercolor paper? When I add liquid to a certain area of the paper, it will expand. But because the area around the paint or the area behind the paint is dry, they wouldn't expand. So this moist area has nowhere to go on the 2D plane. Therefore, it will create this raised area and bend the paper. This raised area is generally unwanted because the paint wouldn't be able to stay on the peak of this mountain. This is especially unwanted in the plotter painting process, because your plotter wouldn't be able to adjust the z-axis height, leaving unwanted marks. Stretching the paper is a way to reduce this effect. The logic behind the stretching is like this. Instead of letting certain area of the paper expand on their own, you're going to add enough water to the whole piece of paper so that this entire paper would expand evenly. While it is expanded to its maximum size, you're going to secure the edge of the paper to prevent it from shrinking back. Now, you know why and how to stretch paper. Let's walk through the whole process so that I can show you different tools used in this process. Step 1. Add water to the paper. The simplest way to do this is just to find a tray, add water, and you soak your paper. You can also use a spray bottle or a brush to wet the paper. Whatever you're using, make sure that you apply enough water on both sides of the paper. Since I started making larger paintings, I need to find a larger tray. Bathtub and showers are definitely options, but I use a pet swimming tool for this purpose. It is compact and it does the job. Just unfold and add water. Step 2. Wait for the paper to expand. The waiting time really depends on your paper. The weight, size, and the material of the paper would impact this. Many suggestions will say 10 to 15 minutes. I am not too precise with this. Sometimes I would wait for 10, sometimes I get caught up in other things and come back in about half an hour. For the paper that I'm using, this has been doing okay. Step 3. Secure the edge of the paper to a board. We will need a rigid board and a mechanism to secure the paper. Let's start with the board. The board needs to be a rigid and waterproof board. I have tried mainly 3 options. First, gator board. Gator board is a high-density foam board that is commonly used for stretching watercolor paper. It is lightweight, strong, and comes in a variety of sizes. It is a really ideal option, but it does come with a price tag, and the price can dramatically increase if you want a bigger one. Despite this, I still highly recommend gator board. The second option that I've tried is wooden panels and plywood boards. In art supply stores, you can find wooden panels like this, which works almost perfect for this job. It is slightly heavier than the gator board, but might be cheaper. If you want more size options, you can just use plywood boards. I use 1/2-inch plywood board for this purpose. It will eventually wear out a little bit during the stretching process, but it's so much more economical and easier to source. You can check out the home improvement or hardware stores around you. 2 things to remember if you are going this route. First, it's likely that you would need to sand edges so that it is not sharp anymore. And the second one is to make sure that you seal the wood because we're going to put a lot of water on those boards. The last option is plastic boards. I specifically meant 3D printed plastic boards. Before diving into this option, it actually makes more sense to discuss the mechanism for securing the edge of the paper. I will show you 3 ways that I have tried in order to fix the paper to the board. First, use tape. When you search for the topic of stretching watercolor paper, pre-gummed tape is probably one of the first things you will see. It is also called water tape. One side of this tape has glue applied to it already. You can activate it by brushing some water on it, and it will stick to a wide range of materials. Masking tape is likely not a strong enough option for this process. Although this is a common approach for stretching watercolor paper, I actually don't really recommend this method for several reasons. The first reason is that this method works well when the board is bigger than the paper. In that case, your tape would be able to remain flat. However, when we're plotting, the plottable area is extremely precious. In fact, my board is slightly smaller than the paper. In this case, I would need to fold the tape around, which I find gets really tricky around the corners. Here is a failed example where you see the corner is not stretched properly. The second tricky thing with this method is to remove the tape after the painting. I haven't found a really good method to remove this tape from the paper. The glue on the tape can be reactivated with water, so you can just add some water and peel it off. It is not a super clean process, but it can be done. Because I'm painting with watercolor and ink, after the painting is made, I really don't want any water to get close to my painting. So I personally think it's a little too risky to re-wet the tape. Besides re-wetting, I also see suggestions to just cut the paper, which I really don't like. Because this method doesn't work for me, I moved on to the second option, staple. Once the paper is expanded, you are just going to staple the edge of the paper to the board. It is much easier to staple the gator board than the wooden panels, but it can be done. So, how many staples do you need? This depends on the paper. The heavier and the larger the paper, the more shrinking force it will provide. Therefore, you need more staples. The removal of the staple is straightforward yet somewhat tedious. Use a plier to pull them out. I highly recommend wearing gloves for this step because it is a repetitive task. 1 or 2 staples are fine, but doing hundreds of staples in one go definitely gave me some blisters in the past. This method would leave stretching marks on your paper. But since this edge is almost always covered during the framing process, it is fine. Because both the tape method and staple methods are somewhat tedious, and they kept producing waste during the process, I was on my way to search for something easier and much more reusable. This is when magnets come into the picture. I took a gator board, I drilled some holes and glued some magnets into those holes. That's it. You can put the expanded paper on the board and you put magnets, and the stretching process is basically finished. When you need to take the paint off, it is also super clean and easy. Drilling holes on gator board is definitely not my favorite process, so I decided to make a board with a 3D printer. These boards have the perfect holes for the magnets, which made things a lot easier. You don't even need glues, you just push them in. I also added some holes on the back of the board so that you don't need additional glue or tape in order to secure the board during the plotting process. This magnet-based stretching method is great, but it also has its limitations. The biggest issue is that it doesn't work really well for larger paper. If you want to give this method a try, the script that I used to generate this board is publicly available. You will need to install Blender in order to run it. There will be a bonus video in this module to show you the process. So, here is a summary of what we have covered so far. That's the entire paper stretching process. When I present this process, I often get 2 questions. First, why don't you just plot directly on watercolor paper blocks? Isn't that stretched and glued on 4 edges already? Why bother taking it apart and then stretching it again? I never directly plot on the block because of 3 reasons. First of all, this paper will still bulge if too much water is applied. It is not fully stretched. Secondly, every time you take a piece of paper away from this block, the thickness of this block would change. That means you will need to adjust the z-axis position of your brush so that your brush is touching the paper. Updating this position after every painting is tedious. I would rather have a consistent z-axis height. Lastly, if something goes wrong and my painting process used too much liquid, it will actually soak through the paper and contaminate the next page. Watercolor paper is precious and I don't want to risk wasting paper this way. Because of those reasons, I don't recommend plotting on watercolor paper blocks directly. The next question is there a paper that doesn't need to be stretched? The answer is yes. There is a type of synthetic watercolor paper that doesn't require stretching at all. It wouldn't require stretching at all because it is basically plastic that wouldn't expand. Yupo paper actually has its very unique properties so that painting on this paper feels very different. However, I don't personally use this paper too much because it takes such a long time to dry. Great, that is all about paper and the paper stretching process. Of course, there are so many other types of materials that we haven't even touched. For instance, panel, boards, canvas paper. I think watercolor paper is a great way to get started, so let's save this conversation for a later module. Thanks for joining me. That's all for this video, and I will see you in the next one.